And before you know it, it's time for everybody's favorite video of the year, the best books list. I'm actually going to give you two lists in this video, my best reads list and my honorable mentions list, because there just aren't very many items on either list. Now you could ask why I don't just make one list out of the two lists if there are barely enough items in either of them to actually make up a full list. However, I wanted to make it really clear that there is for me a huge gap in quality between the books on the two lists. The 4 books on my best of list just leave the rest far behind, and I just thought that they deserved their own exclusive list where they wouldn't have to keep company with the peasants on the runners-up list. So here we go with the runners-up list, which has 6+ books on it. You'll see what I mean in a minute. My first honorable mention would be Kassandra by Christa. This is essentially, at its core, a long literary essay cloaked in fiction about the evils of war, especially, not only, but especially such that affect women. As you probably know, this is styled as a monologue by the Trojan seer Kassandra on her way to Greece, to Agamemnon's palace, as spoils of war. This is, of course, an older book. It was published in 1983, so at a time when writers who were going to write about classical materials were expected to be actually knowledgeable and well-read and educated, have a well-rounded background in classics, because everything else would have been an embarrassing no-go. So reading this book nowadays is kind of a nice change of scenery, if you know what I mean. And I appreciated it for that. However, I thought that its erudition was also ultimately its downfall. Woolf is, first of all, she is a little bit too taken with the scope of her knowledge about the material, and the book is just a bit overloaded with content and references. It's a bit much, and that is why it is at the bottom of my honorable mentions list. The rest of the list, however, isn't really in any particular order. Just a couple of days ago, I finally finished Im Westen Nichts, Neues, All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Remarque. I started reading this book early in the year 2020, and then everything got awful with the whole COVID situation, and I just wasn't in the right frame of mind to continue this book because it is a hellishly hard read. This is, of course, the foundational literary prose text about trench warfare in World War I on the Western Front. And it is a fictional text, but with its character is very much like a documentary. And as such, it kind of documents the making of the lost generation. The generation of young men whose world was shattered by what they experienced and what they witnessed and what they had to do in the trenches. This is probably the one German book that is read more widely outside of Germany than inside, which is really a shame. I think more people should pick it up, and I'm embarrassed that it took me so long to pick it up. 2 German books on my best of list, or actually my runners-up list, but anyway, so this is really unusual, and my next read was also in German. However, it was a translation from the Russian, and that is Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. In a surprising turn of events, for me anyway, this is actually an extremely satirical book about a satire about Russian society, in particular about the bureaucracy and the land-owning class. I randomly read somewhere early in autumn that this was actually a very comedic book, which I didn't know. I always just presumed, because of its title and because of the fact that it is in an old Russian classic, I just presumed that it was going to be all doom and gloom and an awful slog to get through. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. It was not a slog at all. It was extremely entertaining, darkly comedic, and probably the biggest surprise of the reading year for me. Well, the biggest positive surprise, anyway. And we stay in Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, with a contemporary historical novel. It is Natasha Pulley's new novel, The Half-Life of Valery K. This is, for once, not historical fantasy. It doesn't have a fantasy element. However, the story seems highly fantastical, as it is about nuclear research and nuclear disaster in the 1960s, which was wild, especially in a social context in which individual lives were highly expendable. While I thought that it definitely read like an outsider's experience and read like a very contemporary English novel, particularly in the moments that it wasn't supposed to, it just, the character voice, the protagonist's voice and sensibilities seemed very English. However, I still enjoyed it just because the protagonist is one of the most heartbreakingly endearing characters that I've ever had the pleasure to read. And I was extremely invested in his happiness and in the rather heart-wrenching romance that unfolds in this book. My favorite book by Natasha Pulley is still The Bedlam Stacks, and I'd recommend everybody to start with this one if you aren't familiar with her work yet. But I think this might actually be my second most favorite, just because the protagonist is such a darling. My next book is straight up historical romance, my favorite romance of the year, and it came out of nowhere shortly before Christmas. It's The Solstice Cabin by Arden Powell. This is a lovely, magical, extremely atmospheric novella about a man from Toronto who goes in search of his best friend who disappeared on him without explanation and left for a cabin that he inherited from his parents in the mountains of the coast in the northern province of Nunavut. This novella has everything that I love. It has mountains, snow, midwinter celebrations, dogs, wolves, the northern lights, and a little bit of elemental magic. It's absolutely lovely, and Arden Powell just once again nails it with the winter atmosphere. I only just recommended another wintry romance novella of his, The Fairy Hounds of York, and then I learned that he had just published this novella. Such a nice surprise. The next item on my list isn't actually a book, but rather an author, another romance author. It's R. Cooper. I actually read both my favorite book of hers and my second favorite book of hers last year. However, I read a lot of books by her this year, so I thought I'd mention her in my honorable mentions. She just always nails it with the angst and the yearning in her stories, and those are two of my favorite things, or if not my two favorite things in romance novels, romance stories. I should say, because a lot of the books that she writes are actually novellas or even short stories. About two-thirds of her work, I think, are fantasy or urban fantasy stories, and I've only just begun to tap into her urban fantasy works, so I'm glad that there are still a lot of books by her out now that I can work my way through. But if you ask me for recommendations, I'd say for contemporary romances, I'd recommend Hottie Scotty and Mr. Porter, which was one of my favorite books last year, and I link the recommendation video or the review video that I made about it. And if you're looking for an urban fantasy book, I recommend Holly and Oak, which I already recommended in my second to last video, which I filmed and published about wintry romance novels. So you can have a look in there if you'd like to know more about it. And we have arrived at my last item, which is Greywaren by Maggie Stiefvater, which is the last volume of the Dreamer trilogy, which is itself a spin-off of the Raven cycle. And I can't really say much about it without spoiling both the Dreamer trilogy and the Raven cycle. Suffice it to say that the second book in the Dreamer trilogy left us at a place that was just so wild that you wondered how on earth we were ever going to get out of this situation and what was even happening. And it was, I thought, so elegantly resolved in Greywaren. And just as in the Raven cycle, it was a nicely sober resolution to an urban fantasy series, which is, once again, such a nice change of scenery. This trilogy, I'd say, is adult fiction, whereas the Raven cycle is young adult. However, I recommend that you read the Raven cycle before you read the Dreamer trilogy if you're interested in the Dreamer trilogy, because it will just hit you in a different way emotionally if you have the Raven cycle as the background. And the Raven cycle might be YA, however, it has little in common with ordinary YA fantasy these days, as far as quality of writing and the psychological depth and plausibility of the characters is concerned. And with that, we go into intermission. Before I start with my best of list, I wanted to talk a little bit about my reading year in general first and give you an explanation of why my two lists are so short. It hasn't been the best of reading years for me. In fact, it has been quite an atrocious reading year for me, and part of it is my own fault. It's been quite a stressful year for me, and I always gravitated to books that I thought were going to be easy entertainment, but which turned out to be a little bit too easy in the end. And it's really faulty thinking on my part, because the fact is that it is actually the most intellectually engaging books which have the most recreational value. Because books that keep the mind engaged and focused are the ones that will make you blend out all the mental equivalent of white noise and push out all the thoughts that you don't want to think about. So I really don't know why I kept and keep, honestly, why I keep skirting those heavy-looking books. But in my defense, some of the biggest disappointments of my reading year were also actually the book's fault, or the people who keep hyping those books, or those authors. For instance, Regeneration by Pat Barker, such a cowardly bland book for World War I historical fiction. Other than All Quiet on the Western Front, obviously, I recommend Strange Meeting by Susan Hill instead. Or Marlon James's sequel to Black Leopard Red Wolf. What the fuck was that? Or Young Mungo by Douglas Stewart, or aka Shoghi Bane, The Teenage Years. Misery porn set in Glasgow, which would have been innovative and relevant 30 years ago. Or Pieces by the acclaimed Helen Oyeyemi, which is the literary equivalent to an annoying, fake, quirky, and fake, different art history student. Those should have been marvelous books based on the praise they have gotten, the books or the authors, by the literary establishment and also by the bookish internet. So I think I can forgive myself for falling into that trap. However, there were also a few books this year that were all that they were made out to be and more. So here they finally are, my best books of the year. Number 1, or rather number 4, All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. This is quite a heartbreaking coming-of-age story about 2 teenage boys from Texas who leave their homes and cross the border into Mexico in search of an uncomplicated, honest life in Mexico, and then have a very rude awakening when they learn what the world outside their homes is actually like. This book is heavy on the romanticism in the way that the characters' thoughts and feelings are reflected in the landscape. It could have been or should have been eye roll inducing, but somehow it worked, probably because the rest of the story was so extremely sober. Yet another novel by Cormac McCarthy that was an absolute hit for me. He is definitely becoming one of my all-time favorite authors. My third favorite book of the year, Golden Hill by Francis Spufford. This is a historical novel set in the year 1746 in New York, where a Mr. Smith lands by ship one day with a money order of £1,000 in his pocket, which are said to arrive on the next ship a couple of months hence. This is an incredible wealth in the year 1746, and the news sends the high society of the small town of New York into an absolute frenzy. Smith is suspicious, however, he might also be the real deal, so he has to be at least partly integrated and courted by the high society. And the reader knows that there is actually something going on behind the scenes, that there is some scheme that Mr. Smith has cooked up, but we don't know what it is, which would be obnoxious if the narration wasn't omniscient. And this omniscient narration is so well done, and the self-aware and tongue-in-cheek commentary of the narrator about the narration is one of the best things about this novel. It is highly atmospheric too, and the town, alien as it is to the modern reader, really comes to life. There is one extremely memorable episode about a Sinterklaas celebration, Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, and a rooftop chase. It's just an absolute joy to read. My next book, my second favorite book of the year, is also a historical novel set at the same time, but worlds away in Scotland. It is The Game of Kings by Dorothy Dunnett, which is the first book in her infamous Lymond Chronicles series. So this book introduces the Scottish laird Sir Francis Crawford of Lymond, who in the course of the Scottish rebellion against English rule has fallen into captivity in England, but under circumstances that also made him fall under suspicion of being a traitor in Scotland. But now, after a horrible ordeal as a galley slave, he has escaped and is back in Scotland with this very elaborate and convoluted plan to clear his name in the eyes of his friends, and in particular the child Mary, Queen of Scots. And this book and this author is up there on the throne of historical fiction for me, together with Mary Reynolds and Patrick O'Brien. I had the best time reading this book. And I'm so glad that there are 4 more books in the Lyman Chronicles alone that I have yet to read and to fall in love with. And here we are, book number 1, my best book of the year 2022, better even than the Lyman Chronicles, is Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. Wow. Even when I first read the description a couple of years ago, I knew that this was going to be good, and it definitely didn't break its promise. If anything, I underestimated how absurdly funny it would be. The concept of this book is so intriguing. It is structured as an edition of a long-form autobiographical poem by an English professor who was revered for his poetry by his peers and colleagues. And this edition is done by one particular colleague who was his best friend. And it is complete with a preface, then the addition of the text, and then a lengthy line commentary. However, from the beginning, from when you read the foreword, you get the impression that there is something seriously off about the editor and his relationship to the poet. Then follows a ridiculously cringy and bad poem of 999 lines, which is as painful to read as it is funny in how bad it is. And then follows the most ridiculous line commentary, which the incredibly narcissistic and self-absorbed editor uses to tell his own story, but in the most hilariously unself-aware way. A lot of readers, I think, enjoy this first and foremost for its commentary on the nature of reading and fiction. But I myself enjoyed it most of all for how it takes the mick out of academia and about the personalities that you find in academia and about their ridiculous self-aggrandizement and their inability to self-reflect and to put their own self-image into perspective, and for its commentary on academic writing. It just speaks from my heart. It's a book that I wish I had written. So Nabokov and also Dorothy Dunnett are definitely my 2 author discoveries of the year, and I'm so glad that they both have a substantial body of work that I can read and enjoy. So here you go, my favorite books of the year. If you've read any of them, I'd love to know what you thought about them, and do tell me some of your favorite reads of the year if you haven't already done so in a video or an Instagram post, etc. In any case, I wish you a fantastic, portentous beginning of the new year, 2023. It can only get better, can't it? I'll see you again soon, guys. Bye!